Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink, back with more Halloween inspiration. So for today's cards, I started off with some YUPO paper. YUPO paper is not actually paper, it's basically plastic. You could almost use like a transparency or something, but YUPO die cut's easier. And I'll get to why I used YUPO in a second. So I have YUPO paper that I die cut with one of Simon's nested circle wafer dies. And then I have my Tonic craft mat out here and some distress watercolor paper. And then I realized my camera wasn't filming. So kind of skipped a step there. But anyway, I have the distress watercolor paper. I had placed the YUPO circle on it. Then I had misted it with water. And then I'm misting it with a variety of distress spray stains. And also adding a bit of black soot distress oxide spray. So this whole technique was not invented by me. Stacy Hutchison, I think that's how you pronounce her last name. I will link to her blog post in my blog. She did these amazing cards for Tim Holtz with this like this spooky moon background, and she explained what she did in her blog post, and I was literally like sitting there with my jaw on my desk. I was like, I love it. So I had to recreate it. So all the credit goes to her and hers are so, they're neat. You have to check them out. So I will link to it in my blog post, which I'll link directly below the video. So the reason I'm using YUPO is I can use this over and over again. Like you could cut masks from masking paper, etc. But with a technique like this, each time you use the mask, it's done for because it would be coated with the spray, etc. So by using the YUPO, I can wipe that little circle mask off and reuse it over and over again. So I ended up making 3 backgrounds with it, wiped it off. It gets stained, but I can use it for other projects down the road. So with this, you could experiment and use all oxide sprays or all distress spray stains. I think whatever floats your boat. This is honestly the first time I'm really working with distress spray stains. I'm slowly collecting all the colors. I've had the oxide sprays since they were first released. I'm like almost have the entire collection. I've done tons of videos with the oxide sprays. The spray stains are just what they are, like a spray stain, like pure, like liquid and color. Whereas the oxide sprays have that pigment, completely different look to them, etc. So like you could totally experiment. So with these, the cool thing is by masking off that center, that's basically, my moon, and it keeps all this spray from getting on that area. So with my first one, I had used Mowed Lawn and Twisted Citron and then Black Soot. With this one, I used Picked Raspberry, Carved Pumpkin, and the Black Soot. And after I sprayed them on there, I dried it with my heat tool. It doesn't have to be 100% dry, but just dry enough. And then I'm spraying water directly into the center of where that moon was. And that activates all those spray stains because they are highly water reactive. And that's what gives it that cool look because the color starts like drifting into the center there, like right there. Isn't that the coolest thing ever? And it gives it that spooky look to it. I just love it. Love it. These were so fun. You could also wear gloves doing this. I had ink everywhere. I posted a picture on Instagram. Like my hands were stained. I looked like I was bruised. It didn't bother me at all because, yeah, a day later and like most of that's gone. It's, been washed off with the amount of times I wash my hands. But yeah, it's a messy technique. Loads of fun. After I had dried it, like when I had sprayed it with water and then I dried it again and then I, press it into like all these splotches and splatters of ink that are still on my craft mat here. And again, that just amps it up, adds more color, gives it that more spooky look. And the cool thing with this too is you could just experiment with different color combinations. Again, I highly recommend looking at Stacy's blog post because she did 4 different backgrounds and like her color combos, and she lists the colors she used for the color combos, and really cool. So I went my way with this and did the colors that I, gravitate towards, which of course are the brighter colors. And that's the fun of it is, these can totally turn out like so different. So with this last one, I actually got ahead of myself. I forgot to spray it with water first. The only difference with spraying the cardstock with water first is it enables the colors to smooth out a little bit more. But again, with this, I don't think it really matters. So I used Wilted Violet and Cracked Pistachio and then the Black Soot. So I'd sprayed that on, removed my little YUPO circle mask, dried this with my heat tool, and then sprayed the water directly into the center of the moon area so the colors just start to move. So much fun. Dried it again, and then added, like, flipped it over and pressed it into all of these, like, puddles of color and whatnot to add more splatter, more fun, more, like, spookiness, as it were. So I could have gone on and on. Like, I wanted to do all the colors I had. Again, I don't have a whole lot of the spray stains, but this just, you know, amplified my need now to get all the colors for things like this because it's just fun. But I did the 3, but again, there's so much you could do. It would be so much fun. So with this last one, pressed the colors in here and there, added, you know, a bunch of splatter and whatnot, and then dried everything with my heat tool, cleaned off my craft mat, to, like, soak up some of the splatter and whatnot. I'm just using my Tim Holtz flour sack cloth, and I'm going to use that throughout this whole video. I've shown that in other videos too. It comes in handy. So these backgrounds are now completely dry. I'm putting them in my splat box, and I'm going to splatter some Perfect Pearl powder that's in my mini mister bottle with water. So mix that, shook that really well, and then splattered that onto these backgrounds. So then I get that shimmery splatter effect that I love. So heavily covered all of these. I let these dry again, and I had sped it up with my heat tool, but let these completely dry so the splatter was dry so I could add even more splatter. This time it's going to be Picket Fence Distress Paint. So it just gives it, again, sort of that white splatter, but it also picks up, like, as the paint dries, it kind of picks up some of the color from the spray stains. So I'm going to use the Picket Fence paint, mixed it with a teeniest bit of water, and then splatter that onto all these backgrounds with a paintbrush. And if you've never worked with the Distress paints, they are permanent on surfaces. So I always clean my brush, my acrylic block, everything, like, immediately. Don't let them dry on there because they're literally permanent, which is really fun. Again, it depends on what you're into, like, especially the mixed media artists. This stuff's awesome, but I just use it for splatter because that's what I do. So I splattered all these backgrounds with white paint, and then again cleaned up my brush, cleaned up the acrylic block, making sure that all of this was cleaned up, and then I let these completely dry. Once they were dry, I am running them through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 die cut machine with the largest of the Simon Says Stamp WONKY rectangles wafer dies. And this does 2 things. It die cuts it, gives it that wonky stitched edge, plus it flattens them because they're obviously quite warped from the amount of, like, spray and water and heat that I used on them. So this just helps flatten everything out, which makes them a lot easier to work with. And then again, gives it that fun kind of stitch edge. So I ran all 3 of these through my machine with that wafer die. And then once these were all die cut, I'm using a very much non-Halloween stamp. That's kind of what inspired me to do this technique. And because I was like, I wonder how this stamp would look on a Halloween card. So I pulled out the Simon Says stamp. This is the Brushed Branches background stamp. The stamp is huge. All our background stamps are basically 6x6. So I have my Misty stamping tool here. I took out the black foam insert because this is a red rubber on cling foam stamp. So I need that foam insert out of there. And then I lined up one of my backgrounds and lined up the stamp because I only want to stamp like half the tree basically. And I used my anti-static powder tool on the background and then brushed off the excess. And then I'm inking up the stamp with VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. So just a black pigment ink and stamping that. And that looks okay, but I wanted to take it another step because, you know, these backgrounds are very busy. There's a lot going on and I wanted the tree to have a little extra something. So what I did was I coated that stamped tree with some Nouveau embossing powder. And this is the Glitter Noir embossing powder. So it's black with glitter. It's gorgeous. Love. So this is another one of those things where it's like the minute I did it, I was like, oh, this was a good idea. So coated it with that embossing powder, melted that with my heat tool. So yeah, the tree is like black and glittery. And, you know, you can see that spooky moon through the branches. Like, these were fun. These were really fun to make. So did that with the first background, and then I just kept repeating the process. That's kind of the beauty of having like a stamp platform like this, is I can just line up the next background anti-static powder tool, brush off the excess, ink up the stamp with the VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. People have been asking me what's the difference between this one and VersaFine Onyx Black, which I've used literally for 15 years. As far as I'm aware, I think the formula is the same, but I don't know for sure because I don't know anyone at Sukaneko that has actually confirmed that. As far as I'm aware, though, these formulas, they're either very, very similar or they're the exact same. So the only real difference that I can see is the type of ink pad itself. And that's why I've been using this one and not using my VersaFine Onyx Black, because I hate the hinged lid. I like these ink pads better. They fit in my hand better. They're easier to use, and I don't have that lid flying all over the place like I did with the VersaFine Onyx Black. That drove me insane. Always did, but it was such a great ink. Anyway, that's all I know. If you have the VersaFine Onyx Black and you're happy with it, you don't need the VersaFine Clair Nocturne. They look exactly the same. They stamp exactly the same. So that's my 2 cents on it. So anywho, back to the cards at hand. So I finished my last background again, stamping the stamp. This is where I was using the flower sack cloth since I wasn't wearing long sleeves. People have been commenting about that because they're like, man, it must be so cold there. It's so hot here. Oh yeah, it's cold. As of this morning, we got a ton of snow. In fact, it was snowing when I was making these cards. So we're getting a lot of snow up here. It's just loads of fun. But I wasn't wearing a cardigan. So when I don't have a long sleeve to pull over my hand when I'm stamping large stamps, I use something like the flower sack cloth because I can like rub it against the lid and get a much better impression than trying to press down with my hands, on every single spot of the stamp. By using a cloth or your sleeve or whatever and just, doing the circular motions, I find you get a much better and more even impression of your stamps. And more often than not, I don't need to re-stamp it. So after I was done with the third card front and that tree, I just funneled back that embossing powder back into the container. And then for the sentiments, this time I have to put that black foam pad back into my Misty because I'm using a clear stamp this time. And then for the sentiments, I'm using Simon's hand-lettered Halloween. Now these are obviously Halloween cards, but making this, it was like these, you could totally make these into like thinking of you, friendship, birthday, whatever you wanted. Like they're not so like there's no bats or Halloween designs or anything. Like these could just be like cool night sky, spooky, somewhat spooky, but still they're interesting cards. Like they don't have to be Halloween. So that was another thing I was thinking of when I was making these. I was like, ooh, these could be for anything, but obviously I'm going to make them Halloween. So anyway, stamp the sentiment. Stamped it twice with that VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. I really wanted to intensify it though. So this is one of those rare times where I use black embossing powder because 9 times out of 10 or 9.9 times out of 10, I'll just use clear embossing powder with this ink because it's just a good black ink. But I really wanted it black because also I was stamping over shimmer and all that stuff. So I used Ink on 3's Black as Night, which was also fitting with these. Black as Night embossing powder, and it was exactly what I wanted for these because it just kept the sentiments completely black and glossy, and it was perfect. So after heat embossing those sentiments, I pulled out the Sentiment Strips Halloween from Simon. They have a bunch of different types of these. These are pre-printed onto Simon's 120-pound cardstock. And you get 4 sheets of all the same sentiments. So you get, 4 of each sentiment on all these sheets. And all you have to do is cut them apart. And the cool thing is these were printed in toner ink. So you can foil them if you want. I still struggle with foiling and I didn't want to risk it. It's just, I have a love-hate relationship with foil. So I just trimmed down the sentiments using my paper trimmer. And I purposely pulled out my Fiskars little trimmer for this because it has the wire in the middle. So I could place the wire and place the cardstock exactly where I needed it and then trim down these little narrow strips so that I can add these to each of the cards. And then all the remaining pieces, because there's tons and tons of sentiments there, I just store them in little, the Simon Says packs of plastic sleeves that I store my stamp sets in. So I'll set those aside later and then just store them with all my Halloween sentiment stamps and whatnot. So to finish the insides, I pulled that black foam out of my Misty again, lined up the tree. I had to flip it around this time so that I can stamp the insides of the cards so that the top portion of the card base can just kind of hang out the edge of the Misty there. And then to stamp the tree, I'm going to ink it up with 2 different colors of Distress Oxide inks. And I showed this in a previous video using my mini ink blending tools to help kind of smooth out the ink. So I'm going to do that, but I'm also going to use it for another thing too. So I inked up the stamp with Picked Raspberry Distress Oxide ink. And I tapped my mini ink blending tool over it. It just helps really smooth out the ink. I really like how that works. And then I inked up my Distress Oxide Black Soot. And I'm just tapping that. Instead of the ink pad, I'm tapping just the blending tool onto that. So it creates that like hazy sort of look. And then I wasn't sure exactly how this would work, but I was like, well, we'll just see. So I stamped it, used my flour sack cloth to really get a good impression, lifted the lid, and it was perfect. And again, this is another one where it's like, this could be a card front too. Why not? So tons of ideas going on with this one. I had so much fun making these. I couldn't wait to get this video edited to share with you guys. It was so much fun. So second one, I did Mowed Lawn Distress Oxide ink. Tapped it over and over again with my mini ink blending tool. And then inked up the Black Soot again and tapped that. And obviously the Black Soot blending tool is going to pick up the other colors of ink. I only noticed it the most with the Mowed Lawn is there was a fair bit of green on my mini ink blending tool, and I didn't want to mix that with the purple that I'm going to use next. So I just wiped it on my flour sack cloth and went on about making the rest of these. So, and in between each one, obviously, I was wiping off the stamp itself so that I'm not creating a big muddy mess of everything. So for the final one, it's Wilted Violet Distress Oxide ink. Tapping it after I tapped it with my ink pad, tapping it with my mini ink blending tool, and then adding that black soot, just dabbing it all over the stamp here. And then I'm going to stamp that onto the inside of this card. And then once I've got all of those stamped, clean off that stamp, set it aside. I'm going to put the foam back into my Misty. And then I'm going to line up a couple more sentiments from that hand-lettered Halloween stamp set. Just kind of line those up on the inside of the card and then stamp this onto the inside of each of the cards with that VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. So stamp that, took out that card base, stuck in the next one, stamp, remove it, stick in the third one. No time at all. These are done. So once those were stamped, all I have to do now is assemble these cards. I'm going to adhere the card fronts with just my Xyron tape runner. So run that along the edges of the back and then run down the center. And then I'll adhere that to my card bases. And then once that's adhered, I'm going to adhere those little sentiment strips. I'm just going to use craft tacky glue for this because I'm going to adhere them right over that heat embossed tree. So there's like the heat embossing plus the glitter in it. So I find a liquid glue is the way to go to make sure this is really good and adhered. So I just add a thin amount of that glue to the back of the sentiment strip. Card number 1's done, and then I just keep repeating the process until all 3 card fronts are adhered and all 3 of the sentiment strips are adhered. And then once that's done, this is done. I didn't add any other embellishments because I have to like the glitter of the tree and the shimmer of the splatter and like the spookiness of the background and the glossiness of the sentiment. These were good. I was happy with this. These were fun. So as always, I will have a link below the video to my blog post. I will link to Stacy's blog post for you guys to check out in mine as well. And then I'll also have a supply list with links to all the supplies I used, so you can check that out below if you are interested. Thank you all so much for watching and subscribing and thumbs upping and commenting. I really appreciate it. I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye.